The air in the gilded cage was not meant to be breathed, but to be appraised. Like a vintage wine, it was a thick, calculated atmosphere, heavy with the scent of old money, truffled oil, and the faint, metallic tang of ambition. Crystal chandeliers hung from the coffered ceiling like frozen constellations, their light splintering across the dark mahogany walls and catching the gold leaf accents that traced the room's perimeter. The sound was a carefully curated hush, a symphony of muted conversations about mergers and acquisitions, punctuated only by the delicate clinking of silver cutlery against fine porcelain. In this sanctuary for the global elite, the staff were trained to be ghosts, their movements silent, their presence felt only as a seamless anticipation of need. Alara Vance was the most accomplished ghost among them. Her steps were soundless on the plush, wine-colored carpet, her hands steady as she refilled a water glass, her posture a study in professional deference. Her simple black uniform was a canvas of invisibility, designed to erase her identity and leave only her function. Inside Ilara, however, a storm raged. As she moved through the opulent battlefield of power lunches and discreet negotiations, her mind was a world away, in a small, sun-bleached room that smelled of antiseptic and fading hope. Every perfectly folded napkin, every polished wine glass, was a small step toward paying for the crushing medical bills that kept her father tethered to this world. She could still feel the phantom weight of her Columbia Law textbooks in her arms, the exhilarating thrill of dissecting complex international corporate law. That life, her life, had been obliterated overnight, consumed by the predatory hostile takeover that had not only stolen her family's biotech firm, but had also shattered her father's health, triggering a stroke that left him a shadow of the brilliant man he once was. The memory was a constant low thrum beneath the surface of her composure, a silent promise she had made to his vacant eyes. She would not only ensure his survival, but she would one day reclaim the dignity that had been so violently ripped away from them. This restaurant was not her reality. It was her penance, her battleground, and her hiding place, all at once. Her gaze softened only when it fell upon Mr. Rossi, a frail, elderly man who occupied the same small corner table every afternoon. To the other patrons, he was a piece of eccentric scenery, a relic who muttered to himself in what sounded like nonsensical gibberish. They saw a man lost in the fog of senility, but Alara saw the keen intelligence that still sparked in his watery blue eyes, and she heard the familiar, comforting cadence of a language she thought she would never hear again in this cold, new world. It was a nearly extinct Sardinian dialect, the one her grandfather had spoken to her as a child, weaving tales of shepherds and kings under the Mediterranean sun. Each mumbled phrase from Mr. Rossi was a lifeline to her past, a private melody in the soulless quiet of the gilded cage. Listening to him was not a chore. It was a sacred ritual, a moment of connection that fortified her against the crushing weight of her circumstances, a secret language that shielded a small part of her soul from the gilded emptiness surrounding her. The delicate equilibrium of the room shattered the moment Marcus Thorne arrived. The grand entrance doors seemed to swing open with a sense of their own importance, and the maitre d', a man who treated senators with polite indifference, scurried forward, his posture bowing into a shape of pure sycophancy. Thorne did not walk. He consumed space. He was a man sculpted from arrogance, his custom-tailored suit a piece of dark armor, his face a mask of bored, predatory power. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, swept across the dining room, not to see the people within it, but to appraise them, to categorize their net worth, and to dismiss them. He moved through the world as if it were his personal boardroom, and everyone in it was either an asset to be leveraged or an obstacle to be crushed. He settled into the best table in the house, a junior associate trailing in his wake like a pilot fish, and the very air around him seemed to grow colder, thinner, charged with an unspoken threat. This is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing our global audience. And if you enjoy stories where justice is served, make sure you're subscribed. Thorn waved a dismissive hand at the wine list, his knuckles adorned with a heavy gold ring that seemed to absorb the light around it. He began to speak to his young associate, his voice a low, confident rumble that was nonetheless loud enough for the surrounding tables to overhear, a deliberate performance of power. He spoke in a clipped, aggressive patois of corporate jargon and financial acronyms, dissecting a recent acquisition with the detached cruelty of a surgeon discussing a tumor. He was grooming the younger man, teaching him not the art of business, but the religion of dominance. It was during this sermon of avarice that his cold gaze snagged on Alara. He watched her for a moment as she leaned in slightly to hear something Mr. Rossi had said, a small, genuine smile briefly gracing her lips. For Thorn, this simple act of human kindness was an inefficiency, a flaw in the system, and an opportunity for a demonstration. He snapped his fingers, a sound as sharp and offensive as a gunshot in the hallowed quiet of the restaurant. The sound was aimed at Alara, a summons for a servant. She straightened her back, the small smile vanishing as she turned, her professional mask sliding perfectly back into place. She approached his table, her expression neutral, her hands clasped behind her back. Thorn let her stand there for a long moment, enjoying her stillness, her silent obedience. Then, without looking at her, he gestured vaguely with his chin toward Mr. Rossi's table. His voice was laced with a theatrical contempt, loud enough to carry. "Must you coddle the senile?" he asked, not as a question, but as an accusation. "Get our wine." The words hung in the air, thick and poisonous, and a ripple of uncomfortable silence spread through the nearby tables. Some patrons shifted in their seats. Others studied their plates with sudden, intense focus. The junior associate offered a nervous, obsequious chuckle. The humiliation was a physical force, a wave of heat that washed over Alara's skin. She felt dozens of eyes on her, some pitying, some scornful, all of them reducing her to the caricature Thorn had just painted. She kept her spine rigid, a steel rod against the crushing pressure. Her gaze remained fixed on a point just over Thorn's shoulder, a practiced technique to avoid meeting the eyes of her tormentor. But behind that calm facade, her mind was reeling. The scent of Thorn's expensive cologne, a cloying mix of sandalwood and citrus, seemed to fill her lungs, and for a disorienting second, it mixed with the phantom smell of hospital-grade disinfectant. His sneering voice became a distorted echo of the cold, dismissive tone of the lawyers who had dismantled her father's life's work, piece by piece, in a sterile conference room 5 years ago. This man, this titan of industry, was no different from them. He was the same predator in a different suit, and his casual cruelty was not just an insult to her, but a desecration of the memory of the man her father once was, a man who had always treated everyone, from janitors to board members, with the same unwavering respect. Thorn, basking in the power of his public rebuke, was not finished. He turned to his associate, leaning in conspiratorially, yet keeping his voice loud enough for effect. "This is what happens when you have no ambition," he declared, a grand pronouncement to the room. "You end up as a glorified servant to lunatics." He made a sweeping, mocking gesture with his hand toward Mr. Rossi, who remained oblivious, lost in his own world. The gesture was a final theatrical flourish of contempt, a branding of both Alara and the old man as worthless, as failures in his brutal calculus of human value. The associate laughed again, louder this time, a desperate, sycophantic sound that grated on Alara's raw nerves. In that moment, something inside her shifted. The dull, persistent ache of her grief and the quiet fury she had suppressed for years began to coalesce, solidifying from a formless gas into a shard of ice in her veins. Her hands, hidden behind her back, clenched into fists so tight her nails bit into her palms. The invisible waitress was beginning to fade, and in her place, a lawyer, a daughter, and a protector was coming into focus, her eyes fixed on the man who had just made the single greatest mistake of his life. The final insult landed not like a word, but like a physical blow. "Demented old fool." The phrase echoed in the cavernous silence of Alara's mind, striking the raw, exposed nerve of her deepest loyalties. It was an attack not just on the kind, elderly man who shared her secret language, but on the very memory of her grandfather, on the fading dignity of her own father, on every person the powerful deemed disposable. The years of suppressed rage, of swallowed pride, of silent, grinding endurance reached a critical mass. The dam of her composure did not just crack, it vaporized. A profound and terrifying stillness settled over her, a calm so absolute it felt like the eye of a hurricane. The ambient noise of the restaurant, the clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversation, faded into a distant, irrelevant hum. There was only the thudding of her own heart, a slow, deliberate war drum, and the face of Marcus Thorne, a mask of arrogant ignorance, floating in her vision. Her posture changed first. It was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible, yet it altered the very geometry of power at the table. She straightened her spine not with the rigid discipline of a servant, but with the innate authority of an equal. Her shoulders, once slightly rounded in a posture of deference, squared themselves. She lifted her chin, and for the first time, her eyes, no longer veiled with professional neutrality, met Thorne's directly. They were not filled with tears or anger, but with something far more unsettling, a cold, clear, analytical light. It was the gaze of a lawyer who had just found the fatal flaw in an opponent's argument. In that single, electrifying moment, the invisible uniform she wore seemed to dissolve, and the woman who had once commanded lecture halls at Columbia Law stood in its place, her presence suddenly and inexplicably immense. Thorne felt a flicker of confusion, a tiny dissonance in his perfectly ordered world, but dismissed it as a servant's fleeting impertinence. Inside Alara's mind, a decision had been made. It was not a choice born of impulse, but the culmination of 5 years of silent suffering. The image of her grandfather's warm, smiling face surfaced from the depths of her memory, his voice a comforting burr as he taught her the ancient, lyrical words of their ancestors. He had taught her that their language was not just for communication, it was a shield and a key. It held the wisdom of generations who had outlasted conquerors and kings, people who understood that power was a fleeting storm, while roots ran deep. A specific proverb, one he had often repeated when faced with loud-mouthed bullies, bloomed in her thoughts, perfectly formed and lethally appropriate. It was a weapon forged in the mountains of Sardinia, and she was about to unsheath it in the heart of this gilded cage, a place that understood nothing of its true meaning. She turned her body slowly, deliberately, away from Marcus Thorne, a gesture of dismissal more profound than any insult he could muster. She faced Mr. Rossi, whose watery blue eyes were now fixed on her with a flicker of lucid recognition. The world seemed to hold its breath. She leaned in, not as a waitress but as a confidant, and spoke. The words that left her lips were alien to this environment, a cascade of soft, ancient sounds that seemed to absorb the cold, sterile air and warm it with the sun of a distant land. The language flowed from her with the natural grace of a birthright, a melody of rolling consonants and open vowels that was both beautiful and utterly impenetrable to everyone else in the room. It was a secret shared in plain sight, an act of defiance so complete that it operated on a plane Thorne could not even perceive, let alone comprehend. She spoke the proverb, her voice low but carrying a weight that belied its volume. Suciani cia bayat de pruest, sempre suci timet de pru su lupu. The literal translation was simple, but its soul was complex. The dog barks loudest when it is most afraid of the wolf. After the final syllable faded, she did not wait for Mr. Rossi's reply. She straightened up once more and turned her gaze back to Marcus Thorne. She did not need to translate. The meaning was not in the words, but in the unwavering, defiant fire in her eyes. It was a declaration of war he could not understand, a judgment passed in a court he did not know existed. She had seen the fear beneath his bluster, the insecurity that fueled his cruelty. She had named him a coward in a language he was too ignorant to speak. Thorne's face, a canvas of smug satisfaction moments before, was now a confused mess of emotions, his brows furrowed, a sneer fighting with genuine bewilderment. He opened his mouth to deliver what would have undoubtedly been a scathing, career-ending retort, a verbal hammer to put this insolent girl back in her place. But before any sound could emerge, the grand mahogany doors of the gilded cage swung open again. This time, however, there was no sycophantic scurrying from the maitre d'. Instead, a palpable chill swept through the dining room, a sudden drop in atmospheric pressure that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Every hushed conversation halted mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to mouths. All eyes were drawn to the entrance, where a man stood silhouetted against the evening light. He was not physically imposing in the way Thorne was, who used his size and expensive tailoring to dominate a room. This man was of average height, dressed in a simple, impeccably tailored gray suit that was remarkable only for its lack of adornment. But he moved with a kind of gravitational pull, an aura of absolute, unshakable authority that made Thorne's performative power seem like a child's tantrum. His face was sharp, intelligent, and devoid of any discernible emotion. He was known in the circles that mattered not by a name, but by a title, the Regulator. He was the city's ultimate fixer, a man who operated in the shadows where law and finance bled into one another, the unseen hand that balanced the scales of power for the city's true elite. His presence here was an anomaly, a disruption of the natural order that sent a wave of silent panic through the room. The Regulator's eyes, dark and piercing, swept across the dining room, but they did not linger on the captains of industry or the political power brokers. He ignored Marcus Thorne completely, as if he were nothing more than a piece of furniture. His gaze had a single destination, with calm, measured steps that were utterly soundless on the thick carpet. He walked a direct path through the stunned tables, his focus unwavering. He moved not like a guest, but like a man who owned the very ground he walked on. The tension in the room became a living thing, a tightening knot of fear and confusion. He was heading directly for the small, unassuming corner table, toward the frail old man who had been the subject of so much mockery and contempt. The entire room watched, mesmerized and terrified, as this specter of immense power approached the man they had all dismissed as a lunatic. He stopped beside the table and stood for a moment in silence. Then, in a gesture that sent a collective shockwave through the assembled patrons, he bowed his head. It was not a shallow nod of acknowledgement, but a deep, formal bow of profound respect, the kind one gives to a monarch or a holy man. He looked at the old man and spoke, his voice clear, calm, and carrying to every corner of the silent room. Consigliere, he said, the Italian word for advisor hanging in the air like a death sentence. The accounts are settled. The revelation landed with the force of a physical explosion. The senile old man, the muttering lunatic, was the consigliere to the most feared man in the city's underworld. A quiet genius hiding behind a mask of infirmity, a king disguised as a beggar. The blood drained from Marcus Thorne's face, leaving behind a sickly, gray pallor. His jaw, which had been set in a confident sneer just moments before, went slack with disbelief. A fine sheen of cold sweat broke out on his forehead. His carefully constructed universe, built on the simple binary of the powerful and the worthless, had just been shattered into a million pieces. He had not just been rude to an old man, he had publicly mocked and insulted the trusted advisor of a man who could erase him from existence with a single, whispered command. His mind, usually a sharp, predatory instrument, was a frantic mess of panicked calculations, each one leading to the same terrifying conclusion. He had made a catastrophic, career-ending, possibly life-ending mistake. The foundation of his arrogance crumbled, revealing the raw terror beneath. His horrified gaze swiveled from the consigliere and the regulator, who were now speaking quietly in the same Sardinian dialect, and landed on Ilara. She had not moved. She simply stood there, watching him, her expression a perfect, unreadable mask of calm. But her eyes held his, and in their depths, he saw not a hint of fear or surprise. He saw only a chilling, knowing certainty. She had known. The waitress, the non-entity, the glorified servant he had humiliated for sport, had known exactly who the old man was. The strange musical words she had spoken were not gibberish, they were a message, a warning he had been too arrogant to heed. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had inverted with the force of a tidal wave, and he was now the one drowning, completely and utterly out of his depth. For Alara, there was no sense of giddy triumph. There was only a cold, crystalline clarity. The fear radiating from Thorn was a palpable thing, a scent she could almost taste, and it did not satisfy her. It merely confirmed what she had always known. Men like him were not strong. They were merely insulated by wealth and power. Their cruelty was a function of their cowardice. In that moment, she felt the presence of her father, not the broken man in the hospital bed, but the vibrant, brilliant man he had once been. She felt the pride of her grandfather, a man who understood that true strength was quiet, resilient, and deeply rooted in honor. She had honored them both. She had used their shared legacy, their secret language, not as a weapon of aggression, but as a shield of truth, and it had proven to be impenetrable. The regulator and the consigliere rose from their table as one. Their business concluded, they moved toward the exit, the sea of patrons parting before them like water before a prophet. They did not spare another glance for Marcus Thorn, a clear and brutal statement that he was beneath their notice, a problem already solved. As they passed Alara, the consigliere's watery blue eyes met hers for a fleeting second. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement that passed between two speakers of a secret tongue, two souls who understood the world in a way these men of money never could. It was a gesture of solidarity, a benediction, and it fortified her for what she knew was coming next. The room was left in a state of suspended shock, the aftershock of the explosion still rippling through the air. The moment the doors closed behind the two men, the spell was broken, and Thorn's terror curdled instantly into a white-hot, uncontrollable rage. Humiliated in front of his peers, his associate, and the entire microcosm of his world, he needed a target, a receptacle for his fury. He could not lash out at the consigliere, but he could destroy the waitress who had witnessed his undoing. His face, once pale with fear, was now flushed a deep, blotchy red. He spun on his heel, his movements no longer smooth and predatory, but jerky and uncoordinated. He did not walk to the manager's office. He stormed it, his expensive shoes pounding against the carpet, his fists clenched at his sides. He was a cornered animal, and his only instinct was to attack the one creature in the room he still believed he could crush. Alara heard the muffled shouting from behind the closed door of the manager's office. Thorn's voice was a low, guttural roar, punctuated by the manager's high-pitched, pleading responses. She knew what was happening. Thorn was leveraging his immense influence, the fact that he and his firm likely spent upwards of $1 million a year at this establishment, to demand his pound of flesh. He was calling in his markers, threatening the owner, promising ruin if his will was not done. She stood perfectly still, waiting for the inevitable summons. There was no fear in her stomach, no anxiety tightening her chest. The worst had already happened to her 5 years ago. This was merely an aftershock, a predictable move from a predictable man. She felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching a play for which she already knew the ending. A few minutes later, a terrified junior waiter scurried out and whispered for her to go to the manager's office. She walked across the dining room with a newfound grace. The other patrons watched her, their eyes filled with a mixture of awe, pity, and fear. She was no longer an invisible servant. She was the woman who had stood her ground, the catalyst for the evening's terrifying drama. She pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped inside. The office was small and opulent, but it felt claustrophobic. charged with Thorne's toxic fury. The manager, a man named Jean-Pierre, who prided himself on his unflappable demeanor, looked pale and shaken. Thorne was pacing like a caged tiger, his suit jacket now unbuttoned, his tie slightly askew. He stopped when she entered and glared at her, his eyes burning with pure hatred. The tirade that followed was a venomous torrent of blame and accusation. Thorne accused her of insubordination, of creating a disturbance, of deliberately trying to embarrass him. He never mentioned the Consigliere, of course. His fear was too great. Instead, he twisted the narrative, painting her as a malicious and unstable employee. Jean-Pierre stood by, wringing his hands, a pathetic puppet whose strings were being violently pulled. He refused to meet Ilara's eyes. Thorne finished his speech with a direct command to the manager. Fire her. Fire her now, or I will personally see to it that this restaurant is a parking lot by this time next year. The threat was not subtle, and it was entirely credible. The manager wilted completely under the pressure, his professional spine dissolving into jelly. Jean-Pierre turned to her, his face a mask of pained apology. Ilara, ire low, euphorie. I'm so sorry, he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. We have to let you go. Your services are no longer required. Please collect your things and leave immediately. The words were a formality. The decision had been made the moment Thorne had entered the office. Ilara looked not at the manager, but at Thorne. She did not plead, she did not argue, she did not show a single flicker of emotion. She simply nodded once, a gesture of calm acceptance that seemed to infuriate Thorne more than any outburst could have. Her silence was a mirror, reflecting his own ugliness back at him, and he could not stand it. He was a man who fed on the fear and desperation of others, and she was giving him nothing to consume. As she turned to leave, Thorne stepped in front of her, blocking her path. He leaned in close, his voice a low, menacing hiss, his breath sour with expensive wine and rage. Remember your place, he whispered, the words dripping with contempt. You are nothing. A servant, and you will always be nothing. It was meant to be the final nail in her coffin, a parting shot designed to shatter her spirit and remind her of her powerlessness. He wanted to see her break. He needed to re-establish his dominance, to convince himself that he had won. But the words had the opposite effect. They were not an insult, they were a clarification. They drew the battle lines with perfect, stark clarity. He had defined her world, and in doing so had given her the precise motivation she needed to burn his to the ground. Ilara walked out of the manager's office, through the now silent kitchen, and out the staff exit into the cool night air of the back alley. The oppressive, perfumed atmosphere of the gilded cage was replaced by the smell of rain-soaked pavement and city grit. The heavy door clicked shut behind her, a sound of finality. She was jobless. The medical bills for her father, a mountain of debt that never shrank, loomed in her mind. A wave of cold, hard reality washed over her, the adrenaline of the confrontation draining away, leaving behind the hollow ache of fear. For a moment, standing in the dim light of the alley, the sheer weight of her situation threatened to crush her. She had won a moral victory, but her father might pay the price for her defiance. Doubt, a cold and creeping poison, began to seep into her thoughts. She rode the late-night bus home, the glittering lights of the city blurring into abstract streaks of color through the rain-streaked window. The faces of the other passengers were tired, worn down by the daily struggle for survival, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a kinship with them. She was one of them again, cast out from the gilded cage and back into the real world. The weight in her chest was immense, a physical pressure of grief and fear. She closed her eyes, and the image of her father's face, pale and still against the white hospital pillow, swam into her vision. The fear for him was a sharp, stabbing pain. But then another image superimposed itself over the first, the sneering, contemptuous face of Marcus Thorne whispering, "Remember your place." The two images merged, and the fear began to burn away, replaced by something harder, something forged in the fire of injustice. It was resolve. The name he had mentioned to his associate, the name of his firm, echoed in her mind. Thorn Capital. It had a familiar, sinister ring to it, a ghost from a past she had tried to bury. It was a name connected to the worst period of her life, but the exact link was obscured by the fog of trauma and grief. She arrived at her small, cramped apartment, a world away from the opulence she had just left. The space was filled with the scent of old books and the faint aroma of the chamomile tea she made for her father. It was a sanctuary of quiet dignity. Instead of collapsing into bed, she walked to a closet and pulled down a dusty cardboard box, its sides bulging with old manila folders. It contained the remnants of her father's company, the legal documents from its final, agonizing days. With hands that trembled slightly, she began to sift through the brittle, yellowed papers. They were a testament to a life's work, filled with chemical formulas, business plans, and letters of commendation. And then she found it. A thick stack of documents bound by a faded rubber band. The hostile takeover bid. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the dense legal text, a language she was as fluent in as Sardinian. And there it was, on the first page, printed in cold, impersonal type. The acquiring entity, Thorn Capital. The air left her lungs in a sudden, painful rush. It was him. The man who had sneered at her, who had called her nothing, was the very same architect of her family's destruction. The casual cruelty he had shown tonight was not an isolated incident. It was the bedrock of his entire existence. A profound, chilling clarity washed over her. It was as if she had been looking at a scattered, meaningless collection of puzzle pieces for 5 years, and they had all just snapped into place to reveal a single, monstrous image. Her father's stroke, her abandoned career, her life as a waitress. Every single tragedy could be traced back to the actions of that one man. The rage that filled her now was different. It was not the hot, impulsive anger of the restaurant. It was a cold, pure, and focused fury. It was the righteous indignation of a daughter and the analytical mind of a lawyer merging into a single, formidable weapon. Her grief, which had been a crushing weight for so long, now felt like fuel. She was no longer a victim of circumstance. She was the plaintiff in the most important case of her life. She looked at the complex financial reports, at the labyrinthine legal maneuvers detailed in the documents. To a layperson, it was an impenetrable wall of jargon. But to her, it was a map. She could see the strategy, the predatory genius behind it, but she could also sense the arrogance, the belief that no one would ever be smart enough or dedicated enough to unravel it. Thorn had been meticulous, but he was not infallible. His greatest weakness was the same one he had displayed tonight. He underestimated everyone he considered beneath him. He would never in a million years imagine that the quiet waitress he had fired was a Columbia-trained legal prodigy, with a photographic memory and a deeply personal motivation to destroy him. She knew she could not do this alone. She needed resources, access to legal databases, and guidance. Her mind immediately went to one person, Professor Albright, her former mentor at Columbia Law. He was a lion of corporate ethics, a man who had taught her that the law was not just a tool for profit, but a shield for the powerless. He had been disappointed when she had dropped out, but he had understood. She found his number in an old address book, the ink slightly faded. Her hand was perfectly steady as she picked up her phone. The fear was gone, replaced by an unshakable sense of purpose. She was no longer Elara Vance, the waitress. She was Elara Vance, the daughter of a man who had been wronged, and she was about to reintroduce herself to Marcus Thorn. She pressed the call button, the small beep sounding less like a phone call and more like the first shot in a war. Professor Albright's office was a time capsule, a sanctuary of worn leather and the comforting scent of aging paper and old wood. It was a stark contrast to the sterile, calculated opulence of the Gilded Cage, a place where knowledge, not wealth, was the ultimate currency. Thousands of books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their spines a chaotic mosaic of legal history ethical philosophy, and corporate case law. They were not for decoration. They were a well-used arsenal of wisdom, their pages filled with the ghosts of arguments won and lost. Albright himself, with his shock of white hair and eyes that still held the fierce, inquisitive fire of a young litigator, listened to Alara's story without interruption. He sat behind his massive oak desk, his hands steepled beneath his chin, his gaze never wavering. He did not see a disgraced waitress. He saw the most brilliant student he had ever taught, a legal mind of rare and formidable power, now forged into something even stronger by the fires of personal tragedy. When she finished, the silence in the room was profound, broken only by the gentle ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Albright slowly unclasped his hands and leaned forward, his expression a mixture of profound sorrow and a burgeoning, righteous anger. He had seen the work of corporate predators his entire life, had written volumes on the legal loopholes they exploited, but to hear it laid bare with such raw, personal detail from a student he had so deeply admired struck a nerve deep within him. He spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the university. He told her that what Thorne had done was not just business, it was a perversion of the law, a weaponization of the very principles he had dedicated his life to upholding. He saw in her not a desire for simple revenge, but a demand for justice, a quest to rebalance scales that had been deliberately and maliciously tipped. He stood and walked to a small, locked cabinet, retrieving a set of keys. He explained that her student access to the university's legal and financial databases had long since expired, but his own credentials were, as he put it, eternal. He handed her a key card and a slip of paper with a complex alphanumeric code. This, he said, was the key to the kingdom. It would grant her unrestricted access to LexisNexis, Westlaw, Bloomberg Terminal Archives, and every other digital resource a top-tier law firm possessed. It was a gift of immense trust and power, a weapon he was placing in her hands because he knew, with an unshakable certainty, that she would wield it with the precision of a surgeon and the fury of a warrior. He told her to use the library's private research carols, to work in the shadows, and to remember the first lesson he had ever taught her. Every complex lie leaves behind a simple trail of truth. The days that followed blurred into a relentless, caffeine-fueled cycle of digital archaeology. Ilara lived in the hushed, cathedral-like silence of the law library's deepest levels, surrounded by the ghosts of legal scholars. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the cool, constant glow of the monitor, the endless scroll of black text on a white screen, and the quiet, rhythmic click of her keyboard. She was not merely reading documents, she was diving into the past, swimming through a sea of data that was 5 years old, a digital ghost of her family's final days. She dissected every SEC filing, every quarterly report, every press release from Thorne Capital, and a dozen associated shell corporations. Her mind, once dulled by the repetitive motions of restaurant service, was now razor-sharp, firing on all cylinders, reconnecting neural pathways that had lain dormant for years. The language of corporate law, once her passion, was now her native tongue once more. She began to map the anatomy of the takeover, her notes spreading across the small carrel in a complex web of diagrams and timelines. She could see Thorne's strategy, a masterpiece of predatory capitalism. He had initiated a classic short and distort campaign. First came the anonymous, insidious rumors planted in obscure financial blogs and chat rooms, questioning the efficacy of her father's flagship pharmaceutical patent. Then, a series of targeted high-volume short sales, artificially driving down the stock price. Finally, the public release of a biased, deeply flawed research report, funded by an untraceable offshore entity, which served as the public justification for the stock's collapse. It was a symphony of destruction, perfectly legal on the surface, each note played with plausible deniability. But Ilara knew that somewhere in the digital ether, a conductor had to have left his sheet music behind. Her initial search yielded mountains of circumstantial evidence, but no smoking gun, no irrefutable link that tied Marcus Thorne directly to the illegal coordination of the campaign. The shell corporations were registered in the Cayman Islands, their ownership obscured by impenetrable layers of corporate veils. The financial transactions were routed through a labyrinth of banks in jurisdictions known for their secrecy. It was a fortress of legal and financial misdirection, designed by the best lawyers money could buy to be utterly impregnable. For a week, she hit a wall of digital silence at every turn. Frustration began to gnaw at the edges of her resolve. The sheer, calculated genius of the scheme was suffocating. Thorne had not just built a wall, he had constructed a maze with no exit, and she felt a chilling sense of despair, the fear that he might actually be untouchable. The memory of her father's vacant stare in the hospital room became her anchor in this storm of frustration. She remembered his pride in his company not just as a business but as a legacy of innovation and ethical conduct. He had believed in creating value, not just extracting it. Thorne had not only stolen his company, he had desecrated his life's philosophy. This thought was the catalyst she needed. It shifted her focus from the corporate entities to the human element. Who had Thorne needed to execute this plan? He was the architect, but he could not have built this empire of lies alone. He would have needed engineers, technicians, people on the inside of the system who understood the digital infrastructure. People who, like all employees of a tyrant, might harbor a grudge. Her new search began on professional networking sites and in archived employee directories from the time of the takeover. She cross-referenced names from Thorne Capital's IT and cybersecurity divisions with those who had left the company abruptly in the 6 months following the acquisition of her father's firm. It was a painstaking process, a search for a single needle in a continent-sized haystack. She was looking for a pattern of discontent, a name that appeared in angry forum posts or was conspicuously absent from alumni networks. After 3 days of relentless digging, she found him, a man named David Chen, Thorne Capital's former head of cybersecurity. His employment had been terminated for breach of contract just 2 months after the takeover, and his digital footprint was littered with veiled, bitter comments about corporate tyrants and golden parachutes. He was her insider. Finding David was one thing, convincing him to talk was another. He was living a quiet life now, running a small, independent cybersecurity consultancy in a suburb 2 hours from the city. He had been burned badly and was clearly paranoid. Ilara spent a full day crafting the perfect, carefully worded email. She did not mention her father or the takeover directly. Instead, she presented herself as a legal researcher, studying patterns of executive overreach in hostile acquisitions, citing his specific time at Thorne Capital as a period of interest. She offered to pay for his time, appealing to his professional pride and his wallet. It was a long shot, a message in a bottle cast into a sea of paranoia, but it was the only shot she had. To her astonishment, he replied within an hour. His response was cautious, terse, but it contained a single critical word: yes. They arranged to meet at a neutral location, a nondescript coffee shop halfway between the city and his home. Ilara felt a surge of nervous energy, a mixture of hope and fear. This man could be the key to everything, or he could be another dead end, another wall in Thorne's labyrinth. She prepared for the meeting as if it were a legal deposition, memorizing key dates, transaction records, and the names of the shell corporations. She knew she would have only one chance to earn his trust, and she could not afford to fail. Her entire plan, the entire quest for justice for her father, now rested on the cooperation of a complete stranger. The coffee shop smelled of burnt espresso and rain. David Chen was smaller than his online profile picture suggested, a man who seemed to be trying to fold in on himself, to take up as little space as possible. His eyes, however, were sharp and constantly moving, scanning the room, assessing threats. He radiated an aura of deep-seated mistrust. He listened to her carefully constructed introduction with a skeptical expression, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He was a man who had been betrayed by the powerful, and he was not eager to get involved in another fight he could not win. Ilara could feel the interview slipping away, his walls of paranoia proving too thick to penetrate. She made a split-second decision to abandon the pretense. She looked him directly in the eye and laid her cards on the table. She told him her real name, Ilara Vance. She told him who her father was, the name of his company, Vance Biopharma. She watched his face for a flicker of recognition, and she saw it. A subtle widening of the eyes, a tensing of the jaw. He remembered. He had been there. He had been the man tasked with integrating the two companies' digital systems after the takeover. He had seen the digital carnage firsthand. The professional facade between them dissolved, replaced by a shared, unspoken understanding. They were both victims of Marcus Thorne's ambition, two pieces of collateral damage in his relentless war for profit. David's story came out in a torrent, a flood of resentment that had been dammed up for 5 years. He told her that Thorne was a digital phantom, obsessed with secrecy. He operated from a privately encrypted server, a digital fortress within the company's own network, accessible only by him. But Thorne's fatal flaw, David explained, was his monumental ego. He documented everything. He kept meticulous records of his conquest, not for legal reasons, but as trophies. He was a digital big-game hunter who liked to admire his kills. David had been fired because he had accidentally stumbled upon the entrance to this digital vault and had asked too many questions. Thorne could not risk having a man with his knowledge on the payroll. David had been forced to sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement, a legal muzzle that had silenced him for years. He was terrified of Thorne's army of lawyers, of the financial ruin they could bring down upon him and his family. But as he looked at Ilara, at the quiet, burning intensity in her eyes, he saw not a threat, but an opportunity for absolution. He saw a chance to finally fight back against the man who had treated him like a disposable cog in a machine. He told her that before he was escorted out of the building, he had created a back door, a single, hidden vulnerability in Thorne's digital fortress. It was a key he had never intended to use, a piece of insurance he had kept hidden for half a decade. He slid a small, folded piece of paper across the table. On it was a complex string of code. It was the key. Back in the library, with her heart hammering against her ribs, Ilara navigated to a series of obscure IP addresses David had provided. The screen in front of her was a blank, black terminal, demanding a password. It was the entrance to Thorne's private server, his digital throne room. With trembling fingers, she typed in the code David had given her. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the screen flickered, and she was in. She had breached the fortress. What she found was more damning than she could have ever imagined. It was an entire universe of corporate malfeasance, a meticulously organized archive of every dirty deal, every backroom agreement, every predatory scheme Thorne had ever orchestrated. It was a testament to his sociopathic level of organization and his breathtaking arrogance. She navigated to the files dated from the period of her father's takeover, and there it was. Not just a breadcrumb trail, but a signed confession. It was a series of emails between Thorne and a notorious hedge fund manager, a man known for his expertise in short-selling campaigns. In cold, precise language, Thorne laid out the entire short and distort strategy. He detailed the plan to plant the rumors, to fund the biased research, and to coordinate the short sales to create a panic in the market. He had written it all down. In one particularly chilling email, he referred to her father not by name, but as the old fool from Vance Bio, mocking his ethical business practices and celebrating the ease with which his life's work could be dismantled. Reading those words was like being punched in the gut. The clinical, detached cruelty of it stole her breath. This was not just business. It was personal. Thorne had enjoyed it. He had savored the destruction of a good man. The fury that rose in her was so pure, so cold, it felt like it could freeze the air around her. She methodically began to download everything. creating multiple encrypted copies, saving them to a series of secure, untraceable cloud servers. Every downloaded file felt like a small piece of her family's stolen honor being reclaimed. She was no longer just a daughter seeking justice, she was an archivist of a monster's crimes, and she was preparing the exhibit for his public trial. As she worked, a new alert pinged on a diagnostic screen David had taught her to monitor. An internal security sweep had been initiated on the server. Thorn, or his new security team, had detected an anomaly. The digital phantom had sensed a ghost in his machine. A jolt of pure adrenaline shot through her. It was a race now. She had to get everything she needed before the back door was discovered and sealed forever. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, her mind working with a speed and clarity she had never known. The pressure was immense, but it did not break her. It focused her. She was a soldier behind enemy lines, grabbing every piece of intelligence she could before the alarms sounded and the gates slammed shut. She managed to download the last of the critical files just as her connection was forcibly severed. The black terminal screen reappeared, the digital fortress once again sealed. But it was too late. She had it. She had the weapon, the irrefutable proof, the words from the monster's own mouth that would condemn him. She leaned back in her chair, her body trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. The silence of the library seemed to press in on her, but it was no longer a lonely silence. It was the quiet of a battlefield after a decisive victory. The hunt was over. Now the execution of the sentence had to be planned. A lawsuit would be too slow, giving Thorn's legal team years to bury the evidence in motions and appeals. Leaking it to the press was an option, but a man like Thorn had powerful media allies who could spin the narrative, painting him as the victim of a corporate smear campaign. Neither option offered the kind of swift, public, and undeniable justice that her father deserved. The punishment had to fit the crime. Thorn was a man who lived and died by his public image, his reputation as an invincible titan of finance. The only way to truly destroy him was to shatter that image in front of the entire world, to humiliate him in the same way he had so casually humiliated her. Her eyes fell upon a saved file on her desktop. It was a press release she had downloaded earlier, announcing the upcoming Thorn Capital Annual Shareholder Gala. It was the social event of the financial season, a lavish black-tie affair held at the city's most exclusive venue, broadcast live on every major financial news network. It was a night dedicated to the glorification of Marcus Thorn, a celebration of his supposed genius. And at every shareholder meeting, there was a designated time for a question-and-answer session. The irony was poetic. He had built a stage to celebrate his own greatness, and she was going to use it as a gallows. The final piece of the puzzle was access. She needed to get into that room. Her research had shown that her father, in the final days before the company was dissolved, had been forced to convert his remaining assets into a handful of Thorn Capital shares as part of the acquisition agreement. Those shares, forgotten and worthless for years, were still legally tied to his estate. They were her birthright. Using her legal knowledge, she spent the next week navigating a bureaucratic maze of estate law and brokerage transfers. It was a complex but straightforward process for someone with her skills. Finally, a confirmation email arrived in her inbox. A single proxy share of Thorn Capital was now officially registered in her name, Alara Vance. She printed the invitation, the thick, cream-colored cardstock feeling heavy and significant in her hand. It was more than a piece of paper. It was a warrant for Marcus Thorn's arrest, signed and delivered by his own arrogance. She stood in her small apartment, the city lights twinkling outside her window, and looked at her reflection in the dark glass. The tired, invisible waitress was gone. In her place stood a woman who had walked through the fires of grief and emerged as something new, something unbreakable. She held the evidence that could dismantle an empire and the invitation that would let her light the fuse. The stage was set. The final confrontation was no longer a distant hope. It was a scheduled event. The grand ballroom of the Mandarin Oriental was a universe away from the hushed confines of the gilded cage, yet it was constructed from the same essential elements of power and ego. It was a space designed to awe, to diminish, to remind every guest of the immense wealth that had paid for it. The ceilings soared 3 stories high, from which hung chandeliers that were not merely light fixtures, but cascading rivers of diamond-cut crystal. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, rare orchids, and the self-congratulatory hum of 1,000 private conversations. A sea of black-tie suits and couture gowns moved across the polished marble floor, a galaxy of the financial world's brightest and most predatory stars. Elara Vance stood near the back, a small, still island in this flowing river of ambition. She wore a simple, elegant, dark blue dress, a stark contrast to the glittering excess around her. It was a dress she had bought in her previous life, for a law school gala she never attended. Tonight, it felt like armor. She felt no fear, no intimidation. She looked upon the scene not as an outsider, but as an auditor, a silent observer about to present her final damning report. On the brightly lit stage at the front of the room, Marcus Thorne was in his element, a king addressing his court, his voice booming with false modesty as he spoke of record profits and ruthless efficiency. He was radiant with power, utterly invincible in his own mind, completely unaware that his executioner was in the room, holding a single share in a universe of his sins. The formal presentation concluded to a thunderous, obligatory round of applause. Thorne beamed, soaking in the adoration, his chest puffed out like a conquering general. Then came the moment the entire evening had been building toward, the moment Elara had been waiting for with a patience forged over 5 years of silent suffering. A polite corporate voice announced the beginning of the shareholder question and answer session. The first few questions were predictable softballs from fawning investors, carefully chosen to allow Thorne to pontificate on his own genius. He answered them with practiced ease, his arrogance barely veiled by a thin veneer of corporate jargon. Then, a lull. The moderator scanned the room for the next question. With a slow, deliberate grace, Elara stood up. A few heads turned, a ripple of curiosity in the vast room. She was not one of them. Not a familiar face from the financial news circuit. She began to walk toward the aisle microphone, each step echoing in the cavernous space, a sound that seemed to cut through the ambient chatter. The walk felt both impossibly long and perfectly finite. With every step, she felt the presence of her father, not as a patient in a hospital bed, but as the strong, brilliant man who had taught her to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. Her hand, when it finally closed around the cool, solid metal of the microphone stand, was perfectly steady. The spotlight found her, and the entire room fell silent, waiting. She looked directly at the stage, her gaze locking with Marcus Thorne's. For a fleeting moment he looked at her with utter blankness, a complete lack of recognition. To him she was just another face in the crowd, an insignificant variable. He gave a small, impatient nod, a silent command to get on with it. Elara took a deep, steadying breath, the amplified sound filling the silent ballroom. Her voice, when it came, was not the quiet, deferential tone of a waitress. It was the voice of a prosecutor, clear, calm, and resonant with an unshakable authority that commanded attention. "My name is Elara Vance." The name hung in the air, meaningless to the crowd. But she watched Thorne's face for the first crack in his facade. There was nothing. She continued, her tone becoming colder, more precise with every word. "I am the daughter of Arthur Vance, the founder and former CEO of Vance Biopharma." At the mention of the company name, a flicker of something crossed Thorne's eyes. A distant, unimportant memory. He had crushed so many companies, ruined so many lives, they were all a blur. But Elara did not give him time to place it. She began to speak in the language of his world, the language of finance and law, a language she wielded with a fluency that surpassed his own. She cited the specific dates of the hostile takeover, the exact percentage points the stock had dropped after the release of a fraudulent research report funded by a shell corporation named Lyra Holdings, registered in the Cayman Islands. A murmur went through the room. This was not a shareholder question. It was an accusation. The details poured from her in a devastating, methodical flood. She laid out the entire short and distort scheme with the clinical precision of a surgeon. She named the hedge fund manager he had colluded with. She quoted the exact wire transfer amounts that had moved between his offshore accounts and the bloggers who had planted the initial, insidious rumors. The room was now utterly silent, the air crackling with a tension so thick it was almost unbearable. The journalists in the press section were typing furiously, their faces a mixture of disbelief and ravenous excitement. Thorne's face, once a mask of smug confidence, was beginning to crumble. The blood drained from it, leaving a waxy, pale sheen. His smile was gone, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of pure shock. He was no longer a king on his throne. He was a cornered animal, trapped in the glare of 1,000 headlights. Alara then delivered the final, most damning blow. She looked directly into the main broadcast camera, ensuring the whole world could hear her next words clearly. And in an email dated October 14th, 5 years ago, sent from your personal encrypted server, you referred to my father, a man who built his company on a foundation of ethics and innovation, as, and I quote, the old fool from Vance Bio, celebrating how easily you could dismantle his life's work. She paused, letting the sheer, naked cruelty of his own words hang in the air, a poison he himself had distilled. She then turned her gaze back to Marcus Thorne, whose entire body was now trembling, his carefully constructed universe collapsing in on him in real time. The board members on stage with him were slowly, almost imperceptibly, shifting their chairs away from him, creating a physical distance that mirrored their desperate attempt to sever all ties. Thorne opened his mouth, but no sound came out, only a dry, rasping gasp. He was a man who had built an empire on the power of his voice, and now it had utterly failed him. Alara's voice, in contrast, was strong and unwavering as she delivered her final sentence, a statement that was not just a conclusion to her speech but a verdict on his entire life. You stood in a restaurant a few weeks ago, surrounded by your power, and you told me to remember my place. I have. My place is here, Mr. Thorne. My place is taking back the dignity you stole from my family. She placed the microphone back in its stand with a soft, definitive click. The sound was like a gavel falling, the end of a trial. For a long second, a stunned, absolute silence held the room in its grip. Then, chaos erupted. The flash of cameras was a blinding, relentless strobe light. Shouts and questions flew from the press corps. The broadcast was cut, but it was too late. The truth was out. A virus that would infect every corner of the financial world by morning. Marcus Thorne, the invincible titan, was finished, publicly and professionally executed by the quiet waitress he had deemed nothing. Type, Justice, in the comments if you got chills when Alara Vance finally exposed the truth. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was catastrophic and swift, a corporate empire crumbling under the weight of a single, perfectly delivered truth. The SEC launched a massive investigation, freezing Thorne's assets and raiding his offices. The board of Thorne Capital, in a desperate act of self-preservation, unanimously voted to oust him, his nameplate pried from the office door before he had even been formally indicted. His name became a synonym for corporate greed and sociopathic cruelty, his face plastered across every financial publication, no longer as a titan of industry, but as a disgraced pariah. Alara watched it all unfold from the quiet of her small apartment, a distant observer of the storm she had unleashed. She felt not a sense of vengeful glee, but a profound, quiet satisfaction. A sense of cosmic rebalancing. One evening, she received a call from a man named Julian Croft, one of the few board members who had resigned in protest during the original Vance Biopharma takeover. He was an older man, a respected figure known for his unwavering ethical compass. He told her he had watched the broadcast of the gala not with shock, but with a sense of profound admiration. He said he hadn't just seen a daughter avenging her father. He had seen one of the most brilliant legal minds he had ever witnessed in action. He didn't just offer her condolences, he offered her a future. He was now the chairman of a rival, ethically driven investment firm, and he wanted her to build and lead their new division of corporate ethics and governance, a watchdog division with the power to prevent predators like Thorn from ever rising again. Ilara's new office did not overlook the city from a towering skyscraper. It was in a beautifully restored historic building on a tree-lined street, its large windows letting in the warm afternoon sun. The walls were lined not with awards for ruthless acquisitions, but with books on ethical philosophy and sustainable development. The air smelled of old wood, fresh coffee, and purpose. It was a place for building, not for destroying. Her work was challenging and fulfilling, allowing her to use her formidable intellect as a shield for the vulnerable, not as a sword for the greedy. With her new salary, a figure that dwarfed anything she could have imagined, she moved her father from the sterile county hospital to a state-of-the-art private care facility, a place with sunlit gardens and compassionate staff. His condition was stable, the damage from the stroke irreversible, but in his clearer moments, when she sat by his bedside and read to him from the financial pages detailing the collapse of Thorn Capital, she saw a flicker in his eyes, a faint, almost imperceptible pressure on her hand. It was an acknowledgement. It was peace. She had not only paid his bills, she had reclaimed his honor, ensuring that the world would remember him not as Thorn's victim, but as the man whose legacy of integrity had, in the end, proven stronger than all the money in the world. She had found her place, not as a servant in a gilded cage, but as a guardian at the gates of justice. If Ilara Vance's incredible journey from an underestimated waitress to a powerhouse of justice inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of righteous revenge and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a single moment of justice being served.